waiting for a few more people to arrive, but I think we'll just... Shall we just crack on?
Just crack on, yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for coming today to this debate brought to you from Sage and The Conversation. I'm Stephen Cannon, I'm the editor of The Conversation, which some of you may know is a news and analysis site written entirely by academics in conjunction with a team of professional editors, and it's funded by the academic sector. I'm joined today by a fantastic panel. The first member of the panel is Professor Ivor Gaber, who's held a number of senior editorial jobs within the lobby at the BBC, ITN, Channel 4 and Sky. He's now a senior academic at City University. We've also got Arif Ansari, who is a political editor for the BBC in the North West. He's previously worked for Radio Merseyside and Radio City, and has been a political reporter at Westminster as well. As is Helen Nugent, who is a former lobby correspondent from The Times, and is currently freelancing here, based in Manchester, I believe, and has also launched a cultural website called Northern Soul. And last but by no means least is Jonathan Est, a colleague of mine at The Conversation, where he is a political editor. We're going to talk today a bit about the power of political journalism, and political journalists in particular. That might seem strange to some, the day after The Guardian's won a Pulitzer Prize, to sort of suggest that perhaps the power of political journalism is in decline. But actually what we're looking at is something slightly different, and it's quite specifically lobby journalism, and in a sense that Guardian triumph indicates that maybe there's a case to be made that political journalism is in decline, but because that success came very much courtesy of The Guardian being an outsider, and particularly the lead reporter in that, Glenn Greenwald, being an advocate for a particular line and an investigative reporter, and actually something very, very different from a political lobby correspondent as we know it. So in a period when there's a lot of social media, an explosion of social media, and politicians are able to address the media, address the public directly via YouTube, Twitter, what is the role of the political journalist? We've also got a decline in number, especially among regional and print media, an apparent decline in the number of correspondents. What's the impact of that? Is that leaving a vacuum, and how's it going to be filled? I think we've got a fantastic panel here to address these and some other questions surrounding that. But I'll just leave you and bring in Ivor with a quote from the Washington Post last year, which said, "With fewer reporters and more to cover, there's a tendency to paint by numbers among lobby correspondents." Did you paint by numbers, Ivor?
I can neither count nor paint, but I would have. Shall I use the mic, or let me start off with the mic, and hopefully we'll sit down later. Actually, I was worried you were going to start with my quotation, because I'm going to start with a quotation from The Leopard Lampedusa's The Leopard, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. But this, for me, encapsulates what we're talking about. He said, just as the forces of Garibaldi were invading his estate in Sicily, he said to his workers, his peasants, if we want everything to remain as it is, it will be necessary for everything to change. And that is my text for political journalism, because we always need, not only will we always have political journalists, we always need political journalists. We need people who are going to interpret, analyse, investigate, explain, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will be part of what's the Westminster lobby, which has been for almost 100 years, or actually more than 100 years, the centre of political reporting. So what I'm going to look at briefly is why I would argue that although political journalism, and Stephen's mentioned some of its forms, is not declining in my view, perhaps it's getting even more important, the Westminster lobby is in decline, and will continue to be in decline, I think. Now, it's against a backdrop that you're all familiar with of massive changes in the media. I'm not going to list them all of 24-hour news and blogging and Facebook, just list them. But you know what I mean. That's the leitmotif. We can't escape it. It's having a huge impact. I heard a, goodness me, this is terrible for academic, I can't remember the source, but a discussion on television where two young people, even younger than me, were saying the problem with your generation, my generation, is you think the internet is something you do, whereas for us the internet is. And it's an interesting concept. And when you look at people on their mobile, probably spending more time on mobile phones, texting and my-apping and tweeting, whatever, than talking face-to-face, they might well be right. Parliament, one of the big reasons there's a decline in the lobby, I'll give you three central arguments, my 3 bullet points. Firstly, Parliament itself is changing dramatically. It's short, the amount of time MPs are actually at Westminster is in dramatic decline. There's one very simple way of looking at that. Go onto the Hansard website and look at when select committees are scheduled. Select and standing committees are not called standing committees, bill committees are scheduled now. Virtually only Tuesday and Wednesday afternoons. MPs aren't there on Mondays and they're increasingly disappearing by Thursday lunchtime. The MPs and the ministers are only available to lobby journalists Tuesday and Wednesday virtually. That's a major change. It's partly because of the family-friendly hours introduced. It's also because a number of reasons. Fixed-term parliaments haven't helped because we've now got a year where the government's got very little business. It's sending its MPs back to the constituencies all the time. So firstly, there isn't the buzz around Westminster. Well, I mustn't sound too much like an old man, but when you used to walk into the lobby, there was a real buzz. And it's now a sort of zzz. There isn't that sensation. Also, there's very few close votes, which also used to make the lobby an important place. That's been the case actually since the end of John Major. I was in the lobby in John Major's years, and that was fantastic, because you never knew if the government was going to survive from day to day. I mean, thank goodness for the Maastricht Rebels, they made life so interesting. That's been a long time since we've been worrying about governments falling. So Parliament's changing, that's the first point. Secondly, technology, not necessarily the obvious blogs and Facebook that I've referred to, but go back a bit. When I joined the lobby, actually, it had already happened. But, just trying to think of a date, up to about 1980, maybe a bit later, if you wanted to contact an MP or a minister, you physically had to stand in the members' lobby. There weren't mobile phones, there weren't pagers, they didn't sit at their desks in the office because there was no televising parliaments, they didn't know what was happening. They were in the bars and the restaurants and the committees and the corridors. So it was a tremendous power for lobby journalists. They were the only ones who had access to ministers. That's an exaggeration, but it was much, much easier. And then gradually a pager came in, so you could at least send them a message saying, I'm standing in central lobby, I'd like a word. And of course mobile phones made a big difference. And now Twitter and email and so forth, there are 100 ways of contacting MPs. So that simple bit of technology changed a lot. My final third point is the political disengagement that we're all aware of, and actually has been going on a long time now. But the increasing disillusionment with politics in general is focused on Westminster. So the news editor of a regional newspaper, TV station, colleagues can speak about this with more authority than me, would no longer feel compelled to know what are our MPs doing down at Westminster. There's a general sense outside of Westminster that people don't really feel it is as important as it was. There's no longer a sense we must have material from Westminster in the sense it was. I mean, maybe this year's exception, but the 3.5 big events this year, political events, are not taking place at Westminster. The Euro elections, the local elections, the Scottish referendum, and the half is the discussion on the Euro referendum. So Westminster itself is perhaps declining because of the disengagement, and I'm sure Helen could talk about this more than I can, the profound impact, the ongoing impact of MPs' expenses. Ask for ring up. I'll stop that point.
Thanks very much. Perfect cue for Helen.
Good afternoon. I'll start by saying that I'd always wanted to be a lobby correspondent. I worked at the Times for 10 years. I was a business journalist. It seemed like the most glamorous job there was to be going to your office, which happened to be the House of Commons. Unfortunately, the reality wasn't quite like the dream. And so I went down, I started at the lobby probably about 6 months, 7 months before the MPs scandal broke. I actually started the day that Mandelson made one of his many returns back to Westminster, which was the most exciting thing that seemed to have happened to any lobby correspondents for quite some time. And it was glamorous at first, it was fun, you'd rush past Cameron when you were going to get your coffee. But a week or two in, I realised that it wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. The main thing, I suppose, was the sense of entitlement. Not that the MPs had so much, but the journalists themselves. And I realise I'm criticising people in my own profession, but they're quite a weird little bunch, these lobby hacks. They certainly feel that they're at the top of their game. They definitely feel that if you're a political journalist, then you're better than pretty much all the other journalists. You know MPs, you have lunch with them. As you say, you brush past Cameron and that's just part of your daily routine. But there's a more sinister element to that, not just the being able to have a good chat at dinner parties. The sinister element was that they seemed to believe that they were very powerful too. And the thing that I disliked the most was what I suppose I would call tickle-tackle journalism. And the blokes would come back from lunch, and it was mostly men, political journalists, terribly excited that they'd seen George Osborne 2 tables away with an aide from another MP. Or they'd had lunch with, I don't know, a senior researcher, and they've told them something that would be utterly irrelevant to most people, but to them seemed like the best thing they'd ever heard. And a lot of these stories went on the front page of the Times, which to me was just extraordinary, having had a background in investigative journalism and pursuing freedom of information requests, in business journalism, which again is quite a dry subject but can have a lot of hidden stories. So I came to pretty much dislike working there. There was also a problem that, for me particularly, that I had a number of inherent disadvantages. First of all, I was a woman, and I don't exaggerate this, it really did matter. Secondly, I hadn't always been in the lobby, I was new, people didn't really want to talk to you. And thirdly, and perhaps most cripplingly, I was northern. And I'd say Bath and Grass, and people didn't really quite understand what was going on. It's true of journalism as a whole, not just the lobby, that the majority, I don't think I'm exaggerating here, are Oxbridge people. In 10 years at the Times, I never met a graduate trainee that hadn't been to either Oxford or Cambridge, and that's a lot of people. Anyway, so this was how I felt from the lobby, and I actually was one of the few journalists who asked to go back to Wapping, and let me tell you, not many people asked to do that. If you've been there, you will understand why. But then something happened, the MPs Expenses scandal happened, and I can tell you a bit of background about how that came about. I was privy to, because I was just leaving the lobby when that was starting to be sort of flashed around. And the Times was actually the first paper to be offered it, and they turned it down. And then a lot of other Fleet Street publications also went on to turn it down. And there were a number of reasons for this. First of all, they were asking for a lot of money. The person who had it, and we all knew where they worked, I didn't know their name, but I knew which company they worked for and how they'd come across the information, was asking £300,000 for what essentially was a disc of information that nobody knew what was on it. I think the Telegraph ended up paying about £100,000, whilst most of Fleet Street had said, no, we're not paying that much, we're paying because we don't have any money. Secondly, they pretty sure it was illegal. And it's true, I mean, for a long, long time, the Telegraph journalists didn't know whether they were going to go to jail because the police could have prosecuted them. And then it came down to a simple matter of courage. And the journalists I knew, they were nervous about it. The editor was nervous about it. This is before everything happened with the News of the World, of course, and everything that came to light there, with phone hacking. So the Telegraph said, well, if we can have, I think it was 72 hours, with a portion of this disc, we'll then decide whether or not we're going to pay you £100,000 for this. So Robert Winnett, who had recently been a business journalist, I knew him through that, he was at the Sunday Times. He'd recently become a political hack. And he was he's a very, very good investigative journalist, he's totally dogged. And he took it home, essentially. Came back to the office, a day and a half later, and said, we have to buy this. And the Telegraph did this amazing job. Instead of just throwing a few journalists at it who had big bylines and a bit of experience, they created a team which at its height made up of 48 people who were locked away with these reams and reams and reams of pages. course none of which was redacted. And they spent ages on it, and then they drip-fed each story as it came out. And by this time I'd gone back to Wapping, and I was doing some editing and night news editing, and it became the bane of every other publication's life, because only the Telegraph had this information. They certainly weren't giving it to anybody, apart from their other, their reporters. They'd release it at 10:01 each night, so the other papers had already gone to press. So all we did for weeks and weeks and weeks, every newspaper did, was say, this is our top story according to the Daily Telegraph. I mean, it was just worth more than 100 grand could ever have been in terms of free advertising. Massively annoying for us. But later on, when they were forced to publish the redacted copies, I was on that team at the Times. And some of the juicy stuff was missing, so the idea of second home flipping, lots of other things would never have come to light if the Telegraph hadn't had the papers without all these black marks on it. But what you could see was that a lot of MPs have been really, really naughty. They were allowed to, if memory serves, they didn't have to produce many receipts. They certainly didn't have to produce receipts for mortgages and food. They were allowed to claim something like a maximum of £800 a month on a mortgage. I think it was £400 for sustenance. And you could see who the good MPs were because they put in receipts, they itemised it. Some of the rich MPs, and it was mostly Tories actually, didn't claim anything because they had enough money and they didn't want to take it from the taxpayer. But there were some MPs, and a couple of them were ones who did go to jail, who every single month just claimed the maximum amount, 800, 400, 800, 400. One of these was David Chater, who actually was my MP in Bury North. Not only did he not have a mortgage, he was claiming the maximum amount each month. There was no like £700 and 50p, it was just 800, 800, 800. And so you were suddenly able to see just how they were taking advantage of the system, and yes, you could argue it was legal, but was it ethical? Anyway, I'll just end up by saying, do I think political journalism is still relevant? Yes, probably more so than ever. The MPs scandal, not only was it good for Westminster in terms of transparency, it was good for political hacks. There's far less tickle-tackle front-page stories now. The lobby correspondents realise they've had to up their game. You still get lots of stories that are completely irrelevant to the mainstream. And sometimes papers still get it wrong, and I use the example of Maria Miller. The day that, well, it was many, many days of coverage, one of the days was when the Sahara dust was blowing in, and a lot of people, particularly in eastern England, were being rushed to hospital. The Times splashed on an MP's expenses and didn't write about on the front page the fact that half of England couldn't breathe. And that's where I think we still go wrong. But if I had to come to a conclusion, I'd say the MP's expenses scandal was the best thing that ever happened, not just for Westminster, but for lobby hacks too. Thank you.
A defence of the lobby, perhaps?
Well, probably not.
Hi, everyone.
I saw Michael Crick the other day, and I told him I was doing this, and he said, "Oh, that'll be good. You'll be the light entertainment." I'm not really sure I'm going to be able to live up to Michael's hopes on that front, I'm afraid. But let me just start by saying that I've been the regional political editor for the BBC for 5 years. Before that, I was at Westminster for 7. During my time, I'd say that the lobby was not particularly important, not from my perspective anyway. It was useful in terms of having a lobby pass, which I've now got a full lobby pass that you can go and get to the front of the lunch queue and what have you. It's useful to go and stand in members' lobby where the MPs are wandering past and you can grab them for a quick chat, but I think I've probably only done that about twice, and on one occasion got told off by the common staff for having the temerity to sit down on an empty bench, which is apparently reserved for MPs, I found out. But generally speaking, I don't think the lobby has ever been particularly important during my time as a political journalist. I'm sure it was previously. And that's largely because it's pretty much on the record now in terms of what's said. I mean, the real power is if you've got Craig Oliver's mobile phone number and can ring him up to get an off-the-record briefing on what's going on. Now, what I want to talk about is the way that online and the internet changed so much. a lot of that is obvious. Newspapers in decline. I think there's probably no regional newspaper left which still has a dedicated political correspondent based at Westminster. Some of the papers share one, but I don't think anybody's got one precisely. The Daily Post in Liverpool used to do loads of very good local political coverage. That's completely disappeared. Now there is a flip side to that. We get much more blogs, you get specialist web pages. The BBC, if you look at them for example, lots of journalists now doing blogs, and it's easier to go and find the exact specific bit of perhaps a clip or something that you're looking for. So I think there's downsides and upsides. And the other thing that I'd mention in particular, is probably the thing that's altered the way that I work the most, is Twitter actually, in terms of online stuff. Again, upsides and downsides to it. On the upside, you can now broadcast beyond your normal audience. So whereas before I'd be just talking to viewers in the Northwest, or perhaps to people who are listening into Radio Lancashire or wherever, now on Twitter, depending how interesting it is, that can go all over the place and be retweeted. I mean, the time it was the most popular for me was nothing to do with politics at all. It was when I was covering the Manchester riots, and that was being retweeted all over the world, and literally picking up hundreds of followers. If I'd realised the impact, I'd have done it even more, because the guy at Granada, I think, picks up thousands of extra followers. But anyway, that's one of the benefits, the actual broadcasting of your material. The other one is that you can find stories and spot stories which you wouldn't otherwise have seen, which goes well beyond the lobby, but just little stories which bubble up either from party workers or politicians themselves, or just people who are using Twitter and mention something of interest. And the other thing in which it's very significant is in the way that you get a reaction now from your audience in a way that you never did before. So in the past, I suppose somebody might email in occasionally, but with Twitter, they're much more likely to react to something that you've either said on the Northwest Tonight or on the Sunday Politics programme, or just something that you've tweeted out there. And you get that feedback and that reaction in the way that previously you didn't. Twitter's also has speeded up the news cycle. I mean, it was already quite fast with 24-hour news, with Sky, the news channel. But I think Twitter's speeded that up even faster now, in terms of a story breaking and suddenly people reacting to that and retweeting stuff, and possibly politicians reacting to what's been said, and certainly political parties doing so. And in a way, I think that also draws out one of the dangers of Twitter, which is that it's very much not, I think, an impartial kind of political tool, but very much a campaigning tool used by the political parties. And I think you get far more comment and prejudice as opposed to fact and analysis. Not that you can pack in much analysis into 140 characters or whatever it is. But just one quick example of that. We might remember the story about George Osborne jumping on the train and being in first class with a standard class ticket, and then, I mean, that provoked a massive Twitter storm, it really did, and all the lobby moved from Westminster to London Euston to grab him as he got off the train. Now, the truth of it, in my view, is that he did absolutely nothing wrong. I mean, it's perfectly acceptable to sit in first class with a standard class ticket and then just upgrade when the ticket inspector comes along. I've done it myself a few times. Never on BBC Expenses, by the way, I'm talking personally here. But nevertheless, that just took off as a story because it fed into that narrative of, Tories out of touch and all the rest of it. And everyone on Twitter, basically the Labour Party on Twitter, retweeting like this crazy, saying how appalling it was, and the political journalism world reacting to that absolutely. So I think the point I'm trying to make, I think, is that Twitter is very useful, but you also need to be willing and able to ignore it as well. And I think that really is quite important, because people can be putting pressure on you, and you can also come to this false conclusion that this is public opinion, and it's not public opinion. It's very much a self-selected group who are on there with their own agenda. So, because I'm always asking journalists to answer the question, I'll answer the question as well. Is the power of political journalism in decline? I would say it probably is, but I don't feel fatally.
Hi, thanks for coming. I'm Jonathan Est. I work with Stephen, actually, as political editor with The Conversation. I've got a slightly different kind of background because I spent most of my time as a journalist in Australia, where I worked in a national newspaper there. And I can echo, for example, something that Helen was saying about the idea that lobby, or in Canberra, they call themselves a press gallery, they see themselves as a sort of class apart. Lobby journalism in general, here we talk about the Westminster Village. In America they talk about something big inside the Beltway. And in Australia, the leading politics talk show on a Sunday morning is called Insiders. So in other words, it's people who consider themselves to be sort of on the inside, rather than really what journalists should be, which is outsiders looking in, telling us about how the politicians are doing their jobs. Now, I spent sort of 15 or 20 years on newspapers in Australia and then jumped the fence and went to work for the Journalists' Union. And I made a study of what was happening in newspapers and the media in general in Australia and sort of around the world. And some fairly sort of worrying conclusions. And we see, if we look at the ABC circulation figures in Britain, for example, we see double-digit falls over the 12 months. The estimates in the US up to between 2006 and 2012 were that about a third of journalists' jobs disappeared. In Australia, the number of full-time journalists has fallen about a third over the last sort of 6 or 7 years. In the UK, that estimate is between a quarter and a third, and that was up to 2010. And of course, a lot of journalists jobs have disappeared since then. Local papers, NUJ estimates that about 20% of local papers have closed, so you're seeing sort of whole regions that aren't getting covered properly. Speaking of the situation in the States, David Simon, who wrote The Wire, who was a journalist himself, said, "Oh, to be a state or local official in America over the next 10 to 15 years, to gamble freely across the wastelands of American cities as a politician, one of the great dreams of American corruption." And it's one of those great unknown unknowns. If a journalist isn't there, they're not able to do their jobs properly. And meanwhile, as with everything else, national politics becomes increasingly treated like something of a cross between a horse race and a reality TV show. Policy becomes subordinate to personality. The big stories are all about fiddling expenses, they're not about our politicians doing their jobs. What policies they're bringing to make sure that the country is actually going in the right direction. Meanwhile, we've got two defining challenges facing UK democracy this year. We were a month away from the EU elections. We're 5 months away from the Scottish referendum. And we seem to be more interested in whether Boris Johnson is thinking of parachuting to a safe seat. That becomes the all-encompassing type of story that's being run out of the lobby. Again, something Helen was saying. I can remember writing a diary column on the Australian, which is their national broadsheet, and I'd get breathless phone calls from Canberra saying, "You'd never guess so-and-so's press secretary was seen having a drink with so-and-so's chief of staff. Better make that the lead item," kind of thing. You'd have to explain that actually not very many people outside Canberra are the slightest bit interested in that kind of thing. And in fact, I'd occasionally get flown down to Canberra to write stories that our political correspondents didn't want to write, just in case it irritated people and they'd be sort of shut out of that whole brotherhood kind of thing. We've got a bit of a crisis of trust, is the net result of all of this. I was looking at Ipsos Mori, and the latest figures on trust in journalism is 19% of people, just 19%, expect journalists to tell the truth. 70% don't. Well, that's a real problem. It's a problem for journalism. I'll get on to what we do at The Conversation in a short while, but in fact I'll get on to it now. 74% of people expect university professors to tell them the truth. So, we're pleased to hear. So, we've got a situation where, and this is something which if I can sort of blow our trumpet a little bit, it creates an opportunity for, if you like, the sort of non-insiders, for the people whose job it is to study, to become experts in different fields, but they don't consider themselves to be sort of inside the beltway, inside a loop. That is the academic sector, who are, I think you could say, acknowledged experts in various areas of politics and policy. And the idea of the conversation is that they are brought closer to the public through the medium of journalism, by being edited by journalists, by being pushed out using social media. And this is the great thing about, in a sense, the very thing that has destroyed traditional journalism has created an opportunity for democracy to be renewed through, going back 50 years, if you wanted to control what was going on in the media, you had to buy a printing press. Now anyone can have access to the means of production, which means that the public is now given access to people who really know what they're talking about, to people who don't have to push a particular political line because their own wants it to. So essentially, this is the opportunity for journalism and democracy to reconnect. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sophie. And I'm very keen to open this up to questions as soon as we can, and just to explore some of the areas that have been raised and some of the issues that have been brought up in those 4 excellent opening remarks. I think there's a number of themes that that sort of leapt out as me as being particularly interesting. This issue of sort of Twitter turning the lobby into a kind of anthill mob that chases George Osborne around is fascinating, but I'm also quite keen to know more about the impact of Twitter and technology more generally, and also this decline in trust, this decline in investment, and where does that leave the traditional lobby, the traditional